taxonomy aligned with existing industry standards that are in use today, such as FIX and CDM, primarily to ensure that downstream transaction parties receive the structured data they need in the best possible way to reduce the need for manual processing further down the data chain with a view to increasing efficiencies. Today's session builds very clearly on the prior workshop that we held before the summer recess, where we looked at the ease with which GLML can be applied to a document by an individual without any technical programming or coding expertise, i.e. a lawyer or a transaction manager who is drafting the documentation, and that GLML can be applied pretty easily freehand, or actually incredibly easily, using the Word plugin. And for those that missed that or want to refresh that, that session is available as a webinar on the Foundation website at glml.org. We've got a couple of speakers today who are going to take us through today's session. We have Mike Hossack of Allen & Overy and Vic Arulchandran of the Foundation. Mike's going to spend a bit of time recapping GLML and its application, and he's going to have a few thoughts around the importance of alignment of the taxonomy to industry standards and why it's meaningful, therefore, that if you can apply the structured data tagging in the right way at inception by the draftsperson for the document, that's pretty important for the overall process. And then Vic is then going to run us through a number of worked examples of the data chain from inception through the various systems that we all work with on a daily basis. But before I hand you over to Mike and Vic, I want to make 4 points that I'd like you to bear in mind as we go through today's session. Firstly, and obviously, clearly the importance of aligning the GLML taxonomy with existing industry standards, and that actually going forward will be a key part of the work of the Foundation, with a view to recipients receiving structured data in a way that reduces their need for manual intervention and processing. Secondly, I think, just to reiterate, the ease of application of GLML to legal docs, and therefore the ability of the draftsperson as part of the drafting process to tag the document as the golden source of truth, to capture the key data points that market counterparties need as the transaction progresses. And actually, what better way to do this than as part of the drafting process at inception. I wanted, thirdly, to make the point that GLML is not seeking to replace any existing languages in use, but rather it can be easily mapped across existing systems and is in fact entirely interoperable. And lastly, the point is that as an open source specification, GLML is being held and managed by a not-for-profit market foundation, and as such, we regard GLML as being well placed to be developed by the industry to meet the industry's needs going forward in terms of structured data. So I'm going to stop there and hand you over to Mike Hossack. Thanks, Mike.
All right, thanks a lot, Phil. So I'm Mike Hossack. I'm a capital markets lawyer at Allen & Overy. I also spent 18 months working at Navora, and in both of those capacities, I've been involved in the digitization of capital markets transactions. I suppose I'll begin by saying, when we think about what it is that constitutes a security, it's essentially a legal contract, and that legal contract will set out the various data points relating to that security, and it's those data points as set out in the legal contract which represent the golden source of truth in respect of any security. Therefore, any initiative to kind of digitize securities and capital markets transactions therefore needs to start from the legal documentation itself, and therefore requires the involvement of lawyers. Therefore, it's important to have a tool that's easy for lawyers to use without the need to kind of master any kind of formal coding or programming languages. And that's kind of been the focus of previous workshops. But then additionally, there's also a need for a common data standard so that the data points in legal documents can then, which, as we said, representing the golden source of truth, can then be transferred to kind of downstream participants and mapped to existing data protocols. So I was trying to think of a good kind of metaphor to kind of sum this up, and the best I could think of would be kind of thinking about an alphabet and a dictionary. So an alphabet gives us a way to write. We can put the letters together to make words, but unless other readers know what those words mean, i.e., because they're in a common dictionary, what we write is not going to make any sense. No one will be able to understand it. So, in taking that into the kind of capital markets context, obviously it's important to have a way for lawyers or transaction managers or document creators to have a way to create kind of digitized documents with kind of digitized structured data. That's going to be pretty meaningless unless there's a way, unless kind of downstream participants then actually understand what it is the lawyers and the document creators have said in their documents and what those data points kind of represent and mean. So therefore, the work of the GLML Foundation and its members, in kind of creating an agreed market taxonomy, is very important to these efforts to digitize capital market transactions, and something that we at A&O are very closely interested in and following. And with that, I'll hand over to Vic to go into some more detail illustrating these points.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, I will try to share my screen. Pretty bad at this in WebEx. Okay, I'm showing my screen now. If anybody can't see it, just shout out. And feel free at any time to ask questions or to make observations. So having an interactive session would be nicer than just presenting. So I'm just going to walk through a couple of things in today's session, in addition to what Mike and Philip have been mentioning. I want to take everyone through at a very, very high level why we have a GLML markup and a GLML taxonomy. I will then show an example of how the data from a GLML document is more of a process example of how the data from the GLML document feeds through to downstream systems and where some of the challenges are. I'll then show an example of alignment between existing standards. So two examples are FIX protocol for messaging and CDM as well. And I think the CDM example will be quite an important one. What I want to achieve from these next couple of things that I'm going to talk about is to really just give a demonstration or an overview of why it's important not just to have a language that can be put into a document, but also to have a taxonomy or a schema that has been defined and agreed with downstream participants to transactions. So I'm specifically thinking of operational teams and market infrastructure. Now, this is really important. And so I'll go through into that into more detail. And I think also the importance of the alignment of the taxonomy with other industry taxonomies as well. As we've mentioned before, there have been a lot of efforts, and there are still a lot of ongoing efforts in the industry to standardize parameters in transactions and to standardize processes as well. But unfortunately, there hasn't been a great success anywhere. And so we want to ensure that we're not just creating something that fragments the market or fragments how people look at transactions and the data in transactions. The key really here is to ensure that there is an alignment between every data standard. Sorry, I just paused to let somebody in. So the key thing here is, and I'm not going to bore everybody with this, we'll also be putting this video, so I'm recording now, we'll be putting the video online, and we'll be sending the deck out to participants. So don't worry about reading everything on the screen. Key things here to think about is the markup. And as Mike was saying, it's like an alphabet. It's like a language that can be easily put into a document by somebody who's not a programmer. I think this is really important. I wouldn't normally say this, but I've been coding on and off for over 20 years, and I have a PhD in a technical subject. And so I've seen a lot of programming languages and markup languages as well. And coming into this industry, talking to lawyers and non-programmers, we realized that they weren't really being given tools that they can use to make their own documents machine readable. And this is what really gave birth to the idea of GLML. It wasn't a couple of people coming up with it. It was the industry saying, we need something like this. And what we wanted to do is also to ensure that there's a plugin, something that can be used in an existing document creation tool, i.e. Microsoft Word, that can then get these easily to insert GLML language into legal documents. And so that's the importance of the markup. But there's also a huge importance on the taxonomy or data schema or dictionary. Now, this is really key because you can have a language or you can have the alphabet, you can put that into the documents, but you really need to ensure that there is a meaning and an understanding about how that is put into documents, and that the data that's put into the document can be mapped and transmitted downstream in an easier and more streamlined way. Now, at the moment, we know there's a lot of manual key activity, and we want to aim to help and support the industry in reducing that activity and reducing errors in how the data is managed throughout transactions. And so with GLML, I think the goal here is not just to have a plugin that can be installed in Microsoft Word and used to put GLML into documents. The goal is also to empower other technology companies and other large institutions to embed GLML and how they structure some of their workflows and their legal documentation as well. That goes for fintech companies and legal tech companies, especially I would say legal tech companies who are developing document management and document creation platforms. They have quite extensive tools on how to create and manage and collaborate on documents. And it would be quite an easy step for a GLML implementation there as well, where once documents have been produced on those platforms, you click a button and GLML is inserted in there so that it can be used as a standardized, not a standardized, but a machine readable GLML document. So if I pause every now and then, it's because I notice people in the lobby. And again, please, if anyone has any questions or comments or even criticisms, feel free to jump in. As we released a little while ago, we did release a simplified version of the GLML taxonomy. It's all available online, so the links are on the GLML website. Some of the key things in this taxonomy that I'll go through now is actually the definition of the markup, so the actual markup language that's put into the documents and what they mean, and also why this is important downstream. But I'd like to start with an example. So I think many people on this call will be aware of the example from the US where fines were brought in for incorrectly submitted data to the CSD. And on the screen, I've put the fines. I think these are still accurate. For example, it's now $10,000 per QSIP for an incorrectly submitted maturity date into DTCC. And there are a number of these fines that have been brought in. And the goal of these is not really to make money from it. The goal of these was to try to discourage incorrectly submitted data into the clearing system. But when you go and talk to the IPAs and issuers and dealers, the challenges they face is it's not that they want to submit data incorrectly, it's that a lot of this information is processed manually. They're receiving pricing supplements and program documentation, which has terms and terminology written in different formats, different permutations. They have to understand these things, type them into their internal systems, and put them into their databases, and then transmit data further on down the train. And of course, it's inevitable when you have people doing manual work, there will always be errors. This is just simple key entry error. But in a transaction, these can be quite costly and have profound impacts further downstream. On the screen now, I put an example from some of the challenges there. So you can see in box 1, something that can be written down as a fixed interest rate has many different permutations of how it can be written in a program document and a pricing supplement. It could be written as fixed interest rate, could be written as just coupon or coupon rate or interest rate. And so when teams, especially operational teams and market infrastructure, receive these documents with many different ways of writing something simple as a fixed interest rate, you can see how some of the challenges in the key entry and the transferring and the mapping of data occurs. Now, these are just 4 examples I've put on the screen of many, many examples we could be going through, where key data points are written in different ways in documents. They then need to be understood and mapped to an internal requirement in an internal system. So for example, an operations team in their internal system, they may be writing always interest rate, but they've got to pick up a document. On the document, it may say fixed return amount. They need to understand that that means an interest rate, and they've got to type that into their internal system. And this is where, of course, errors can always come up. So the key thing we're trying to do here with this discussion about GLML is to say, if GLML is inserted into the underlying legal documents, not just the pricing supplements, but the actual program documentation, as Mike and Phil were talking about earlier on, you then have right at the beginning of the process, the underlying legal documents marked into a structured, machine-readable language. And once you've got that, instead of having the manual key entry at every step of the way, you can actually then begin to automate certain steps like mappings and transformations. And this is what's really the enabler. This was what was missing several years ago, is being able to produce very quickly and easily a document, a legal document, that was in a machine-readable format, and then to use that data throughout an entire process. And I think the key here is to also note, I'd like to also note this point about different terminology. We're not talking about creating standardized and templated documents, because we appreciate that everybody likes to create a document in their own way. It's not just about standardized pricing supplements, term sheets, and standardized drawdown documents. It's really about saying, here we have GLML. You can put this language into whatever bespoke document you have, and it will make that document machine readable. And when that document is used in a transaction, it could be filled in through a platform or through a system, or it could be used for other different processes downstream. It doesn't matter. What really matters is, say, you don't have to change the way you structure your own documents, but just using the GLML just makes those machine readable. And that's a very important concept here. Now, the other thing I'm going to briefly talk about, which we will go into more detail in later workshops actually, are the ability to use GLML to digitize validation and eligibility rules as well. So if you think at every step of the way, when you're looking at data coming into your system, you are applying rules to it. So like I was saying to this example earlier, fixed interest rate, maybe an interest rate comes in a document, and your team needs to look at it and make sure that the percentage sign is written there and the decimals are to the correct decimal place, that kind of thing. A lot of that is manual now, and it has to be typed into a system and needs to make sure that the data has been validated. And that's a simple example, but of course, there are examples around registration. And I think a key piece, and especially in issuance process, is ensuring that when the term sheet is submitted to the clearing system, that term sheet is eligible, it makes that instrument eligible for registration. And what happens at the moment is usually the market infrastructure will look at this information, they may match it with details they have on their internal systems, they'll apply some logic to it, and then they'll give a response back, yes or no. What we want to do also with GLML though, is to actually digitize and make some of this process automatable. And the way that we've been able to think about doing this is allowing some of these business and operational teams to also write their validation and eligibility rules in a way that can be that GLML can be inserted in there as well. So what happens is you end up having program documents, pricing supplements, any other legal document, which has been made machine readable with a markup language. But then you also have the rules that are applied to this data coming in, also managed directly by the business teams, but marked up by them in a machine readable language as well. The combination of these two is what really starts to enable the digitization and the kind of automation of a lot of activities in the middle of these processes. And that's really key. It's difficult to jump to automation without having some of these staples in place. And if they're also being worked on by different parties in the market, that's what will create more fragmentation. And with the GLML Foundation, we're really trying to bring these efforts together and create that discussion about what everybody should be looking at together in order to enable different technologies to thrive in this market. Moving on to the next slide. So I think, so now we've talked about the markup language itself. I've given an example of some of the problems that have been arising. for example, in the US, from incorrectly submitted data points. And those data points are being submitted incorrectly because they're not being mapped properly from the information coming into those systems or to those people. And a lot of this work is being done through manual key effort, manual key entry, and just human effort. The next thing I wanted to cover, though, is some of the mappings between different systems. So here we've got some arrows going out into different databases. And what this really, okay, excuse my poor diagram, but what this is really trying to show is through a process, there are lots of different steps and places where information has to be taken off into a different system. You know, a document comes in to a front office, they may pass it to an operations team. Operations team has to type stuff into a system, for example, to send information out for settlement or to register information for compliance. All of that is usually manual. And that involves a mapping, whether you realize it or not. You're reading information from a document coming in or from another message coming in, and then you are making sure that that is transferred correctly into your own internal system. And that's all a mapping. Now, at the moment, because that's all been done usually through non-machine readable documents, you're starting with a manual effort, or you're having to create a system that can capture that through some kind of workflow. And you have people going in and typing that information in. What we really think with GLML, though, is if you have marked up all the documents, underlying documents with GLML, you can then enable more streamlined and less manual mapping between systems. The goal, of course, being that all of this would be automated. So program documents, term sheets are all marked up in GLML. You can then use them throughout a transaction. And every time you're interacting with your own system internally, you don't have to do any mapping or think about anything. All you're doing is interacting with your own system, and you're focused on what you need to do from a business perspective. And we think that the GLML will really enable some of this activity to happen in this way. And again, just highlighting what I mentioned earlier, this allows program documents and term sheets to actually remain bespoke. Everybody likes standardization and templating, and I think that those efforts should continue in various different ways, not just in primary markets. But of course, we appreciate that legal documents, especially, need to be written in particular ways, and everybody has their own way of writing something. So it's very important that the GLML is empowering teams to make their own documents machine readable without thinking again about having to template anything. And the key here, as I was saying earlier, is to allow non-programmers to use a markup language. I think that's really, really important. And I would implore anybody who are thinking about looking at different markup languages, go and have a look and see, just have a look at them yourselves and try them out. And we would really be open to the feedback on GLML too. We'd really like to understand how we can update and improve GLML based on other things that are happening in the industry. Also, by making those underlying documents machine readable, it enables a more structured way to do the mapping, a more structured and automated way. But then going on to the kind of the key part of this session is it actually then enables other technology solutions to achieve higher levels of automation and straight-through processing. But importantly, we really need the operational and market infrastructure teams to be involved in this process of defining the taxonomy or schema or data dictionary. And the reason is, of course, going back to here, you can have lawyers putting GLML into the underlying documents. Those are really where all the information is held from the beginning of the transaction. But unless you're defining what that data needs to look like at every step of the way and in your own internal systems, you are not going to have the most meaningful information coming through any technology solution. However, if there's a coordinated effort, not just with the law firms, but between the law firms and the market infrastructure and the operational teams within dealers and other entities, on defining what data points each party needs downstream and how they need that data to be defined and what metadata they need with that, etc., then we can start to build up this taxonomy of terminology, not just of a markup, but also the definition and the meaning behind all of these terms. And everybody could agree to that. And then you can, of course, have your own bespoke documentation, your bespoke internal requirements, etc. That's all fine. All that mapping can be done in a more automated way with a agreed industry standard and taxonomy. And I think that also speaks to the importance of aligning with other efforts in the industry, especially around fixed protocol and CDM, because I think there are lots of as I said before, there are lots of different standards in the industry, and there are new ones coming up, almost every 2-3 months, each one trying to do something slightly different. And I think at the end of the day, probably in a few years' time, there'll be a couple of standards remaining, and there'll be kind of an amalgamation of all the good work that's going on around the industry. Now, the key thing, though, is that there are already quite robust languages in place for things like transmitting data between systems. And what we're trying to do with GLML is align how GLML can be implemented into documents to what already exists in transmitting data between systems. Now, of course, everybody knows about fixed protocol. It's been around for a long time. It's quite robust, and they are continuously updating the protocol right now to include things like even blockchain transactions. So what we want to do is ensure that there's a mapping between GLML language and taxonomy and what exists in the fixed protocol taxonomy as well. And that's a key effort that's going to begin soon. We've already done some work around this, but that's a key effort that we want to coordinate with participants in the foundation. And that's really key, because what we don't want to do is, again, create more fragmentation, but also not disintermediation, but we don't want to create more intermediary languages that are going to then be involved in transmitting data between systems. Things already exist that everybody uses. We want to make sure that those are compatible with new languages that are coming out in the market. Now, I've got 3 examples here from some work we've done on understanding how to express ISDA's CDM through GLML in the underlying legal derivative documentation. I'm not going to talk through these, but when I share out the slides, I'll put some more description on these, and we can open up a discussion with anybody who's interested. This is really interesting for us, because what we did is we looked at some use cases here, for example, floating leg of an interest rate swap, a fixed leg, and also an FX swap. And what we tried to do is we said, okay, this is how CDM is showing that this instrument should be expressed. But to get the data into this CDM format from a GLML format, that's going to be in a legal document. So let's say we have a derivatives document marked up with GLML. With those parameters, those GLML tags, and the meaning behind those GLML tags inserted in the legal doc, that can then be, because that's machine readable, the data from there can then be extracted and mapped to a CDM compliant format. And we've shown 3 examples here. And I'm happy to talk more about this later on the call if anyone has any questions, or we can take it in a separate workshop, which is what I would actually like to do. But this is really key, because the CDM effort is going to be a very important one for the industry, and ensuring that there are machine readable documents that can drive the beginning of the process for getting information into a CDM compliant format and using CDM standards is going to be really important in driving some of that STP work and alignment across the industry. And here I've done a very rough diagram of, if we have a CDM, taxonomy as well. The GLML taxonomy can ensure that it's not just aligned with CDM, but also other taxonomies in the industry. And every time GLML is inserted into derivatives documents or other legal documents, there can always be a check between this taxonomy and the other ones. Asking questions like, are these labels up to date? Are they accurate according to the source of the taxonomy, which is in CDM? Do they have the correct meanings, and are they being inserted properly? If all of this is done correctly, and there is that alignment between GLML and the other taxonomies, this will allow this whole process, if we go back to that kind of, for example, an issuance process or trading process, this is what will really begin to enable more of an STP process of data in a structured way, but also enable that more automated and structured mapping between different systems and different documents. So yeah, this is just something that we've been looking at over the past few months. And yeah, we really welcome a discussion on this as well. So before I finish, just wanted to recap the 3 things that I covered. It's the markup language and the reason why it was created and why we think it's important. And there's also an alignment between some of the key law firms involved here who are creating a lot of these program documents on the use of GLML. Second one is that taxonomy and schema. There's a few that exist in the industry. There really needs to be an alignment between all of them. And what we're trying to achieve with GLML taxonomy is aligning with all of those and ensuring that everything is in one place and can be inserted into documents. That's going to be really important. And the third one is aligning with existing standards, especially for transmitting information between systems. These things exist and they're robust, but also for new things like CDM, which are going to be really important for standardizing and structuring complex transactions in the industry over the coming years. And that concludes my part of the workshop. Bill, over to you.
Many thanks, Vic. That was hugely detailed, and there's an awful lot of information in there. So as mentioned, this will be posted as a webinar on the website for anyone who wants to re-watch that section. And for those participants who'd like to follow up on anything around the alignment discussion around FIX and or CDM that Vic ran through there, please do get in touch with us via the Foundation website, and we can set up a separate session with you. And it may well be actually that we do decide to hold the next workshop on this topic, but in more detail. In terms of next steps, there will be a fourth workshop coming up. A date will be circulated for that. The content of that is currently being developed, mainly based around some ongoing project work that we're involved with around the taxonomy and alignment, as discussed. So please do look out for further communication from us on the date and the content for that workshop. I'm going to pause here now, and if anyone has any questions they'd like to raise or observations, please feel free to do so. I understand it's quite a big group, so it may well be that people feel more comfortable dropping us a line separately, so also please feel free to do that. Unless there's anything else from anyone, I propose that we end today's session there. We were booked in for an hour, but as usual, we're well under time, so you've got half an hour back to your day. Thank you very much for participating, and we look forward to speaking with you in about a month's time. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.